with you.
Hi, everyone. That was too kind of an introduction. It's not all at the same time, but the cold winters are pretty hard. Just you have to embrace them. So today I want to talk to you all about. First of all, I'm joining you from Ottawa, Canada, and I want to talk to you. Hence the winters, the Canada part. I want to talk to you about what it takes for us to create successful digital solutions. And I know there's a lot that goes into that, but I want us to cover 13 guidelines that are kind of a starting point because we see that there's a digital boom out there, right? Like it's happening right now, yet some things are not really getting better. And one of those things, for example, is medication adherence. It We have all these apps that remind us to take our pills, yet we're not doing any better than in the 80s, despite all this technology. So, what does it take for us to create successful digital solutions? So, just to add a little bit to Iggy's introduction, my I currently work at a healthcare consultancy called Macadamia and Technologies, where together with a very interdisciplinary and wonderful team, we co-create solutions and products with our clients, typically in the healthcare space, but also outside. And what my title is, it's a mouthful, behavior and cognitive experience researcher. But what it really means is that I do the typical things that we encounter in UX based on human behavior, so usability observations, ethnographic research, and so on. But I also have a background in cognitive science. So I dabble in things like neuroscience, really interested in psychology and behavior change, and things that sometimes are not aligned with what we observe, or they go an extra level to what we observe. Because as we all know, we're not the best at saying why we make the decisions we make always. Sometimes some of those steps happen subconsciously and we don't have visibility into them, or we may think we do, but we don't always do. There's a really fun study on that with someone put 5 pairs of socks and people were asked to pick their favorite one. And I think they always picked the one on the left. And there was no difference between those pairs of socks. And they were rotated all throughout. But really, it was a position effect. And no one knew that answer. But that's what we learned. So there's things like that happen subconsciously that we need that extra layer to dig into. That being said, today we'll start talking just a little bit about habit formation, kind of the main framework, and then jump into things that we need to consider to really accomplish successful behavior change. So we'll talk about barriers, we'll talk about the shared person product journey, and then we'll dive into the 13 behavior change guidelines or principles and look at a few examples. So that being said, let's go right in. So the psychology of habit formation, I could do a talk just on that, but for time's sake, I'm going to review the most common one, which is reminder, routine, reward, or the 3R. This reminder, routine, reward sounds really simple, right? If you think of it. So we need something to remind us, whether it's an alarm or something like that, the routine or behavior that we're trying to change, and the reward itself that we get if we've done the job right. And that could be anything. It could be the satisfaction after a long run, or the 5 kilos we lost, or it could even be the icing on the cake at the end of a week. If your goal is to lose weight and your treat at the end of the week, the cheat day is a reward, it could be any of those. And it sounds really simple, this 3R model: reminder, routine, reward. But in reality, if it were this simple, well, we'd all be the best version of ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I snooze my alarms many, many times. So let's see. On average, I ask this question very often, so please answer in the chat. And we'll see after what you guys said. On average, how long does it take to form a new habit? 5 days, 21 days, or 66 days? Iggy, I don't see the chat, so maybe you can give me an insight into what people are saying.
Sure, no problem. We're just waiting for the responses.
What's your response, Iggy? Putting you on the spot.
I, I think for me it's between 5 and 21 days, but I'm kind of leaning towards 5 because
Okay,
I feel like 21 is an old way of thinking. Times have changed. The world has moved in many different ways. So the adoption rate has also increased. Is what my logic is telling me.
very nice. You put the dot on the I. So 21 days is a myth. It's a complete myth, but the actual answer is 66 days. Um, but
Most people,
what? Yeah,
sorry, just to quickly interject and then I'll go mute again. Everyone so far has responded with 21 days.
yes. And it's not just you here. It's pretty much the whole world. I've done this across countries, and the answers very rarely are 66 or almost never. But the actual answer is 66 days. And what really matters that I want you guys to remember is not the actual number. It's what Iggy was saying, that things have changed, right? And there's variability between us. It can be as fast as 18 days, but it can take up to 254 days. And that depends on the habit, that depends on the person, that depends on the conditions in which we're trying to change this habit. And the list goes on and on. So there's a lot of variability that we need to consider. And that's why personalization and understanding the needs of individual users is so crucial. And one of these things that makes it so difficult or easy for some of us to change particular behaviors are barriers, which often are not accounted for when we create a digital solution. So, this is just an example from a study looking at the barriers of people with um, living with diabetes, and they're trying to manage their sugar and physical education. And barriers include things like financial instability, the lockdown, which closed down gyms or things that were their main form of physical activity. People who work night shifts have a difficulty maintaining the same balance and work life balance when it comes to diet, not having social support, stress, all of these things can contribute. And you can see right from the list, it's not just for diabetes. It can transfer across different conditions, right? But then there's also things that change. And this difference between what helps, the barriers, and the advantages differs from person to person. And for one person, it changes over time too. I may experience lack of work-life balance during my PhD, and I may have a perfect life-work balance 3 years later with my ideal job, right? So those things change, and we need to account for them, and we need to account for those changes. And another thing that also changes, something that reflects these changes, I like to think of it as the person product shared journey. And it's really straightforward. I like to think of it as a relationship. There's a pre onboarding phase, which is kind of like a first date. That's where you first encounter the product or the solution, and you either give it a second chance or you don't. That's it. Is it at first sight, or you walk away and you never meet that person again, right? So this first date is pretty crucial whether there is a second or not. But many people forget about the pre-onboarding stage, that initial interaction with the product. The onboarding is when you start learning about the person, almost like a honeymoon phase. So you start discovering what's special about them, the app's functionalities, and how easy it is to use it, right? So it's what value does it add to you? And if that goes well, then you actually make it to the daily usage, which is using an app day to day for as long as you need to. And so many teams focus on the daily usage stage, but forget about the first two. The problem with forgetting about the first two is that you can lose a lot of people on the way. So then you only satisfy the ones that actually make it to the daily usage. And this fourth stage, growth and beyond, it's not always necessary. So I want you guys to remember that, because not all apps have a long life purpose till death do us apart, right? But some of them can have some functionality that keeps users engaged for the good purposes after having already achieved their main goal.
Yes.
Please forgive the interactions. I'm in a bit of a public place here.
Okay.
So now I'm going to jump into the 13 behavior change principles. And we'll go over those and an example for each. So here are the principles at a glance. And what's really beautiful about these principles is that if you look at them, there's words like trust, credibility, transparency, motivation, education. These are words we all know. These are words that resonate with all of us, right? But what makes it really difficult is, how do you translate education? How do you translate motivation? How do you put these things into a product? That's the difficult part. So let's see. Trust, transparency, and credibility. This one kind of has several layers. For one, I'm sure you all know this and we've experienced it as users ourselves. Today's apps ask for so much information and all these agreements, and there's no end to it, right? So we have to trust and have faith that whatever that app is collecting that data in good faith, because we've seen many examples otherwise. So the app needs to build that trust in us, be worthy of our trust, and be transparent about what is going to do with that data. Credibility, well, that's the other side. That's another responsibility of the app. If the app says it can help me lose weight, or it can help me take my pills regularly or become a better runner, why? What's so special about that app? So here, one example I like is Headspace, which is a meditation app. And what they tell you is they're a 7-person in-house science department. So I come from an academic environment. This resonates perfectly with me. I know exactly what the National Institute of Health is. I know all of these regulatory bodies. This telling me that they have 65 plus research studies, that speaks to me. And different forms of credibility speak to other people. But this is one that works. Another responsibility of the app is to determine the person's motivation. So, what happens is, whenever we talk about behavior change, we most often talk about intrinsic motivation, which is the one that's personal to us, we care deeply about, and it makes it easier to change any behavior. But that's not always the case. If someone was recently diagnosed with any medical condition and they're just learning all the difficulties about that condition and just accepting the diagnosis, they don't have intrinsic motivation yet. It takes time to cultivate that. So the app needs to figure out what kind of motivation the person has. Is it intrinsic or extrinsic? And depending on the type of motivation, they can tap into that and cultivate intrinsic one. I really like Noom, which is an app that helps you improve your or change your eating habits. And what Noom does, it kind of uses the same technique we use in interviews, or a variation of the 5 whys approach. Yeah, 5 whys approach. So it keeps asking you about your ultimate goal. And the first time you answer, it may be something super superficial, like running your first skate. And then as you keep digging and going deeper, someone may say things like, I want to lose 15 pounds so that I can feel good in my own skin. And that is meaningful. And then once you tap into that motivation, you can use that time and time again as inspiration, as motivation, as reminder, as ways to cultivate intrinsic motivation. There's a wonderful chapter about this in Amy Buchanan's book, Engaged Designing for Behavior Change, which I highly recommend. It's so rich in examples and beautiful. And what we talked about from the beginning, when we talked about those barriers and how they differ, individualization or personalization are key. There's no telling how important it is for us to account for people's different motivations, attitudes, starting points in their journey, risk profiles, if we're talking about medical conditions, preferences, all of those. The better we become at personalizing something, the better we can engage people with a particular solution or product. And here, from my personal experience, it's really interesting because we live in a time where that's becoming more and more doable, in the sense that slowly we can even move away from personalizing at the persona level. So a group of people, archetypes, and so on. But as we start bridging UX and AI, we can personalize more and more at the individual level directly. And that's why I was keen on putting individualization rather than personalization. So this is another example, a meditation app. It does something very simple. It asks you to start saying, how experienced are you in meditating? And based on that, it tailors someone's journey. If I'm not experienced, you can't jump me into something really complicated because I'll give up. So something as simple as this can determine the path going forward and keep someone engaged. Education itself is also huge, particularly in the health or security spaces or things that are not quite common sense for all of us because we're just exploring something new or we were just diagnosed. It's really important for us to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it, how it benefits us. Sometimes we see apps where there's some goals in there that we have no idea what they have to do with epilepsy or diabetes or whatever the actual purpose of the app is. And they have a goal, just most of us don't have that knowledge to just know it as we're embarking on a new journey of behavior change. So my fitness pal does a really nice job here. It just uses colors to kind of teach you what's good for you, what's not good for you. And then salmon, let's say it's good. Next time you're in a restaurant, you're going to have this image in your head, or you're going to remember salmon is a good option. So it has this nice educational content that you can take with you, and it influences your decisions going forward in a very simple and intuitive way. It's also really important for us to have goals and to be able to revise those goals based on our products. And just as I was saying earlier, it's really important that these goals make sense and they're reasonable and they relate to our outcome. So if you tell me hydration, I have to understand how hydration relates to epilepsy, for example. Or if I'm trying to control my diet, you can't tell me to eat half a banana because chances are that's not going to happen. I mean, I could freeze it and make banana bread, but then again, that doesn't help me with my nutrition, right? So, really, these have to make sense and they have to be feasible in normal conditions. I really like Quit Now because It has goals related to things that tap into both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So it has days quit and time won back and cigarettes avoided. So if we think of time won back or days quit, that's really personal. That taps into my intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, something like dollars saved, well, maybe it's a behavior that I need to make because I can't afford it. So then it really accounts for both types of motivations, tapping into the extrinsic but cultivating the intrinsic one as well. And as we're going through these goals, people should also receive feedback. They should receive feedback based on their progress timely, and they should know what to do with that feedback. If they're told you didn't meet your goal yet, that's not useful. They need to understand how to act on that feedback to get closer to their actual goal. So the Garmin app, for example, tells people how they're doing over time in terms of kilometers, so you can see your progress relative to what you want to do. But it adds an extra element. It actually does this social comparison part, which pushes us towards a little bit of competition. Just a caveat here, this works in some places, but not in all. So I would caution with that one. Reminders, this is a very straightforward one. We all need some form of reminder because repetition is key to forming a new habit. But reminders need to be more than an alarm on our app, on our phone, because we all know that doesn't work. We've snoozed at least, if you've snoozed at least once, you know it doesn't work. So what Fabulous does, for example, it tells people to put sticky notes or advises them to put things that they can learn from in their environment. So modify your environment so it's conducive to your behavior change. So in my case, I need to drink more water, and this is not staged. I always, I don't know if you guys can see this, I am surrounded by water bottles and some bad influences too. But always, I have water in my environment and a sticky note that says if I see someone in a meeting drink water, I drink water as well. Engagement mechanisms, these are all kinds of techniques that help the person stay engaged in the process. And here, the trick is to really consider that motivation that we talked about determining earlier. And they also need to be rooted in the psychology of habit formation and consistent with cognitive findings. So we don't want them to be addictive, right? For example, if I'm working on an app that helps with gambling, I don't want the elements that I'm using or the gamification techniques that I'm using to keep the person in the app to be the same principles that are making someone addicted to gambling in the first place. So there's a difference between engagement and some forms of gamification, but we have to be careful with that addiction element in between. So a really effective cognitive behavior technique is journaling. This allows people to kind of achieve their goals and stay grounded in what they're trying to achieve. So I really like this one. And not only that, the app itself, LifeWorks, provides the journaling as a technique, but as you can see, it also has that that educational component telling you why you should be doing it. This one's a very easy one. Looks matter too. How the app looks, the colors, the imagery, the tone should be aligned with the brand and intent of the app. So I'll show you a really straightforward example. This is My Sugar app. It's for diabetes. It's a diabetes management app, and it has this jumping around little guy. And some people love it. Just thinking of my own family, my dad would love this. It's hilarious and entertaining. Whereas other people would say, I'm not in kindergarten. Why? What's this? Is this a kid's version? Right? So here, that personalization is key. Connection is probably one of the most common sense ones, but also very often misapplied. Too many times people think that human connection means interacting with another human directly, but there's also ways to connect with humans without actively interacting with them. That indirect way, learning about their stories, knowing that you're in a competition or in a group or other people in your community are doing the same thing. So I think the key takeaway here is to remember that it doesn't always have to be a chat or a person on the other side. It could be the story and the learning and the knowing that other people are experiencing the same, or perhaps they're experiencing nearby you. A very interesting one is usually we promise to a person, right? And there's studies showing that if we make a public promise commitment, we're likelier to keep up with it. Well, the Fabulous app asks you to promise to the app. So it's not public, no one else knows, but you still go through that social commitment to keep you on track. Relevance, this one is really tied in a bit with the education. So we need to understand how everything that's in that app is relevant to what we're trying to achieve. And part of that is the timeliness of it. If I was recently diagnosed with something and I get all the information all at once, that's cognitive overload. I don't know what to do with it. I may give up because it's too much. So I need to receive the right information at the right time, and I need to understand how it ties in to my ultimate goal and how it guides me. What are those steps and milestones? So Mindshift helps people with anxiety. And what it does is it provides individualized experiments to cope with it. So, for example, sending an email with a spelling mistake. So it's kind of exposure to things that you may be anxious to without the full extent of of the experience itself. Sorry, I lost my word for a second. Transcendence and empowerment. This relates to that fourth stage in the product person shared journey. So this one doesn't always work. What really is all about is that once I finish my goal, I need to know what's next. If I'm done with an app, I need to know what to take to transfer outside of the app to continue that good habit. Alternatively, it could also be that maybe the app has something that keeps me engaged longer time after I've accomplished my primary goal. But if it has something like that, we have to be really careful that it's something that truly benefits the person. And sometimes those things are empowering us or making us tapping into our feeling good, elevating us from being a user or a learner to mentor and contributor, things like that. So this Clue Plus is a period tracking app, and what it does is it the data that you provide. So let's say someone starts using it to ensure that their periods are regular and deal with that and achieve a certain stability. And once they achieved it, they technically don't have another reason to use it. However, the data is used in clinical trials, and there's very limited research on this, and it's anonymized to help people around the world. So this is something that can resonate with a lot of women, and it helps someone become, instead of a traditional user, they also become a contributor. And last but not least, a very often forgotten one is the person app environment loop. So this one says that the app should account for the user's environment, measuring and looking out for changes, adapting the experience in the app as a result. So we've seen things in, during the pandemic where diabetes apps would recommend going to the gym or aqua fitness classes or walking with a group in your community. Well, those were no longer applicable because of the conditions of the pandemic. Yet the apps that don't always respond to that. So people were left finding their own ways, and sometimes they didn't. And it became more and more difficult to replace the activities that they were engaged in. Similar changes happen seasonally when there's colder weather and some of the activities are no longer available, or when someone switches from a regular 8 to 4 schedule to night shifts that can really impact someone's diet, for example, or sleeping schedule and so on, right? So keeping an eye out for changes like this in someone's behavior and responding to them is very important. This is just a visualization to show the close interaction between the person, the environment, and the app. The idea is that these apps don't exist in a silo, so we need to account at all times for changes in all three and how they impact each other. And Noon, for example, did a really good job acknowledging COVID and providing resources specifically related to COVID, even though their main goal is someone changing their eating habits. But of course, the stress, the anxiety, everything that goes on can impact that. So they took that extra step, accounting for changes in the environment. So just a few quick takeaways. Behavior change basically is really hard, and that 3R model is just the beginning. We have to think deeper of those barriers, of the journey, of the changes all throughout, and these guidelines, and there's more than 13, this is just the start, but these guidelines that go beyond usability to lead to meaningful change. And once I shared the slides, I included a few more resources for you guys here. I'm going to stop sharing so you can see everyone.
Roxana, thank you so much for that awesome and insightful talk. There's a good few positive comments in the chat. I see we've got some questions. If there are any more questions, please add them to the Ask a Question component. So the first question is, what is the role of marketing in changing behavior?
What is the role of marketing? I think that to me that goes it's part of the pre-onboarding because it's part of that first interaction with the product or solution. If my first interaction is not positive, then I'm not gonna have a second one. So whether it's just even the image, right? Like some first impressions are subconscious. So that's where my cogsci part comes in. They're formed in milliseconds. So you can do studies that look at heat maps, like first click paradigms and all that, to really test out what resonates with people in that early phase of exposure. Or what are those words to instill that credibility? What counts as credibility with different groups, with different cultures, with different uh, populations, right? So to me, that's a bridge of UX and marketing.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, that definitely, I hope that answers the question, James. And then we've got one more question. How would you go about changing behaviors of users, asking them to use your app ahead of another? Side note, the app doesn't have certain important features that the competitors have.
I think you should add those features. It's really pointing out what is unique about your app. So, for example, there's some apps that are coming from the medical field that don't have the aesthetic experience and everything that an app by a big team with lots of resources in UX and research and design. But if they're able to say why they're so valuable, what makes it credible, then they can enhance and elaborate on the other elements. So if I do it for a medical condition, I would this is a personal opinion, but I would rather, to me, more valuable is knowing the clinical team behind it or the hospital it's coming from, as opposed to the flashiness or the appearance. But in an ideal case scenario, you want to have a kind of touch on all the points. But the beauty about these heuristics is that the first exercise anyone would do is prioritize which ones are most important for your audience and then start working on those to make sure you hit the right ones first.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We've got, so there's one more question in the comments, but I'll ask it over here. Um, we can, I think you're answering it as well. We follow your work? And that's a question from
I'm
Lindy.
mostly on LinkedIn. I am not a big social media person.
Sure,
I am when it comes to conferences, but yeah, I'm a big LinkedIn fan. They could do some
sure.
more, but
Thank you. We've got two more questions. And the first one's from Tamarin. What books or courses would you suggest to gain more insight into your field?
that's a great question. I think it really depends on what exactly you are looking for. I read more journal articles than books because they're more condensed and they're faster. I am a big fan of literature reviews. Unfortunately, a lot of them are hidden behind the barrier of, academic terminology, which is a shame. And the other barrier is the fact that some of them are paid. So as much as if I am a big proponent of connecting industry with academia and governments, and part of it is access to the resources in academia. So if I'm doing a study with people with alcohol abuse, um, like an app to help people who use alcohol more than they want to, first thing I would do is a literature review because we always have limited access to people and we don't want to, be invasive and ask the same questions all over again. Mm. If people have spent tons of years and money and energy and resources in doing those studies, we can gain that background from existing research. So I'm a big fan of looking for journal articles. And sometimes the abstract is enough if you can't afford paying for it or you're not connected with the university. And the abstracts are typically available for free. And there are a lot of open source ones. So that's where I would start. I don't know if I have a particular book in mind. One thing I would look into are, if you're really interested in behavior change, is differences between cognitive behavior techniques or engagement techniques and gamification techniques. What are those subtle differences? Because that's huge when you're in fields like healthcare, for example. It's quite different than social media, right? Our goals are different and the means to achieve engagement should be different too.
Thank you. Um, if there are any books that you want to list at a later stage, you could ping me, and then I'll add it to the description of when we post the
Perfect.
talk on YouTube.
Well, Darren
Um,
has recommendations of tons and tons of books that he went through, and he always prioritizes them very nicely. So I think Darren is the person to ask for this one.
Thank you, thank you. And it's fitting that Darren is the next talk. Um, so the last question is from Christopher. What ethical considerations would you say we need to be careful of if we take these learnings into our own value propositions? My thinking is that when businesses we work for realize they could shape behavior of their own products, this creates a sense of power and opens opportunity for manipulation.
I think that's a really really insightful question, and I think that's where that difference between cognitive behavior techniques and gamification techniques comes in, because we're not looking for the same kind of engagement. There's engagement that really benefits users. And the key there is, as you go through the journey, let's say if you're working on a medical condition, on an app for a medical condition, we're experts at what we do, but we're not experts at the journey for that medical condition itself. So enhance your team with the right people. There's co-participatory design sessions between healthcare professionals and users. There's all kinds of methods to bring in the right experts, and then you can kind of have that filter because you think something's a best practice from a research or design perspective, but maybe it's not for a particular culture or it's not for a particular condition. So bring in those unique voices.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the Q&A. If there are any more questions, like I said previously, we'll be posting the talk on YouTube, some snippets on LinkedIn shortly. Please connect with Roxana. Yeah, she's awesome.